Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're bringing back our game optimization guides. It's pretty crazy to think it's been almost a year since we did our last guide of this kind when we checked out Red Dead Redemption 2, but here we are back in the optimization hot seat to check out Ubisoft's latest title, Watch Dogs Legion. After playing this game throughout this week, I think it's fair to say this game has fairly hefty hardware requirements. Today's video is not going to be an FPS benchmark where we test Watch Dogs Legion across a range of GPUs, but if you want to enjoy both ultra settings and high frame rates, you'll need some serious processing power. A GPU like Nvidia's GeForce RTX 3090 is only capable of around 60 FPS in the open world at 4K without ray tracing, a far cry from the 120 FPS average the 3090 was capable of across 14 games in our day one review. Obviously, the first thing people will say when they see this performance is that Watch Dogs Legion is poorly optimized, but I think this phrase is thrown around a bit too liberally for PC games, as not every game is the same. An open world title with lots of NPCs and large draw distances like Watch Dogs is never going to perform as well as a more linear title like, say, Doom Eternal or Resident Evil 3, so I prefer to compare one game to others of a similar type, in this case other big open world titles. There are some aspects to Watch Dogs that are quite visually impressive, especially when exploring London at night. The lighting effects and overall world design are spectacular at times and look fantastic at 4K. However, daytime visuals are less impressive and I think show the limitations of the game engine Ubisoft are using, which is mostly designed for last generation consoles. When you balance up the visuals to performance ratio, I think Ubisoft are coming in a bit under expectations using ultra quality settings. Not as terrible as a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, but not like a Horizon Zero Dawn or Metro Exodus, and let's be honest, neither of those games were perfect either. In any case, there is some optimization work that can be done here, so in today's video we'll be working through every quality setting in the game to show you the visual differences using in-game footage, as well as the performance gains you'll get from moving to different settings. At the end, we'll wrap it all up and provide our thoughts on the best setting configurations for playing Watch Dogs Legion. Before getting into the comparisons and charts, I did want to walk through our test setup. On the hardware side, we're using an Intel Core i9-10900K test system with 16GB of DDR4 3200 memory. Ideally, for a game like Legion, I'd also be wanting to test with different CPUs, as the game can be quite CPU demanding as well, but that's just not possible in the time that we've had for this video. Steve did do some benchmarkings of CPUs at 1080p, which you can see here. Before this particular guide going through quality settings, it is just with the one CPU. So we've focused on GPU-bound situations, which for most people will be how you'll play Legion, but I'll also comment on some settings that do impact CPU performance for those that will be, say, right on the edge of a CPU limit. As for the GPUs we used, as usual, it's a range of cards from Nvidia and AMD in different price segments with results averaged together. We primarily tested with mid-range to high-end GPUs at 1440p though, just for your interest. In contrast, all game footage used today is captured at 4K on an RTX 3090, but we didn't use this GPU for the performance sections. There are a few limitations to today's numbers that I wanted to discuss as well. Watch Dogs Legion uses a dynamic time of day system with a day and night cycle, which significantly complicates this sort of testing, which we want to be as repeatable as possible. There is a built-in benchmark, but from what I can tell, at least for GPU limited performance, the benchmark overestimates the average performance you'll see while running around the open world London. Ideally, I'd like to use an in-game pass as it's more representative of performance, but with the day-night cycle, this was difficult, so we stuck to using the built-in benchmark. The second aspect is that Ubisoft are already talking about game patches for Legion that will improve PC performance, especially for driving around the world, which admittedly does need some work. I'd have loved to test Legion for this video using a patched version, but due to time constraints, this simply wasn't possible. I'm pretty sure these results will still hold up over time, as it's not really a GPU benchmark, but a comparison between settings, but due to some upcoming hardware releases we have to work on, we just can't justify spending more time testing this game, at least for now. Anyway, that's all the preamble necessary. Let's get into some results. We'll start with the presets, and there's 5 of them. Every aspect of the game's visuals are modified through these presets. However, to me, the top 3 presets are all pretty good. The main differences between ultra, very high and high are the draw distances for high detailed geometry, the quality of shadows, especially for distant shadows, and texture filtering. However, the drop down to medium and low is more substantial, losing further geometric detail and turning off what appears to be distance-based shadowing. The biggest loss from dropping the preset from high to medium is in reflections. While none of the presets use ray tracing by default, high and above all employ screen space reflections to some degree, which look particularly good at night. Dropping to medium and low removes this effect, which is especially noticeable on water surfaces. The Thames River here looks like a dark swamp on the medium preset instead of a nighttime river on high and above. Looking at performance, moving from ultra to very high is a pretty simple choice for many that just want a quick and easy performance fix, and I'd say even the high preset is a solid candidate. I found around a 30% performance gain moving from ultra to very high and 50% from ultra to high, with most of the visual settings intact. Medium gives a bump again, but without those reflections, I think this is only suitable for entry-level GPUs. Preset scaling is also respectable, with an 87% gain going from the highest to lowest, which should make Legion playable across a range of hardware. Geometry affects the level of detail within a scene. A higher setting means more detailed objects and environments further into the distance. While this setting only bottoms out at high, there are some clear drop-offs in detail even when moving from ultra to very high, with ultra giving the most detailed environments as expected. In terms of performance, even when GPU limited, there are some clear gains to be had from moving ultra down to very high or high. However, given the quality loss can be substantial in my opinion, I'd recommend keeping this on ultra for most gamers, unless badly CPU or memory limited. We'll get some gains from other areas. The environment setting controls a number of elements in the game, from things like foliage and terrain quality to smoke and particle effects. In most instances, I found this setting to be reasonably hard to distinguish the differences between, although the draw distance for high quality grass and trees does suffer in some situations. I tested this setting both in the built-in benchmark and in a demanding section of the game, and I'm showing the in-game results here. For most people in these intense situations, I'd recommend turning down the environment setting from ultra to high, but probably no lower than that so we don't lose further particle and smoke quality. A 7% gain here is significant, although it was more like 3% in the benchmark. Textures is an interesting setting. While there are differences between all 5 texture settings, and you'll need the HD texture pack installed to access ultra textures, the differences are quite subtle, even at 4K. While ultra is slightly sharper and more detailed than high, and high is slightly better again than medium, all 3 of those modes are pretty close for detail, and when playing at 1080p or 1440p, I'd say that difference is basically negligible. What you don't want is to be playing on low or lowest textures, which are noticeably more blurry than the other settings. Textures are quite complicated from a performance perspective because Watch Dogs Legion uses a lot of VRAM. If you are playing under the VRAM limit, you should set the textures to as high as you can, in most cases ultra. That's because the difference between ultra and medium from a performance perspective is quite similar, assuming you are under the VRAM limit shown in the game, so you may as well enjoy ultra textures. However, I would not recommend exceeding the limit shown in the settings menu. For example, ultra settings with ultra textures at 1440p is shown to use 7.6GB of VRAM or over 8GB at 4K. Playing at 1440p ultra with ultra textures at 1440p on a card with 6GB of VRAM is quite stuttery, as the VRAM limit is clearly being exceeded in gameplay. In this instance, dropping down to high or even medium textures will get you below 6GB of VRAM usage, 6.5GB for high textures, 4.4GB for medium at 1440p, and given medium looks pretty close to ultra, especially at low resolutions, that's not a bad trade-off. I think this is super important to note because VRAM will be a complaint about Watch Dogs Legion for those with 8GB cards or less. Turning down textures is something most people aren't willing to do, but at least in this game, I reckon high and even at times medium still looks really good. With that said, people with 6GB cards will be sweating big time on that VRAM limit, and even 8GB is dicey for higher resolutions. Texture filtering is an easy one. Turning this down to anything below ultra makes textures look like crap, especially for ground surfaces where a lot of detail is lost in the high setting. Bizarrely, even just turning down the global preset from ultra to very high reduces texture filtering, when in my opinion this should be left at ultra nearly all the time. In any case, you'll see a 2% gain to performance from reducing texture filtering, which isn't worth it for the drop-off in visual quality. For a game with generally very high resolution texture work, keeping this setting maxed out is a must. Shadows is a major performance limiting setting in the game. Each increase to the setting here improves shadow resolution and the draw distance for high quality shadows. The medium and low settings appear to turn off distance-based shadowing in favour of a more basic calculation method, which results in sharper but lower resolution shadows with more aliasing. The performance gains you can get from the shadows setting are enormous. Moving down from ultra to very high, we'll see a 14% frame rate increase, then from ultra to high, it's 25% with diminishing returns beyond that. Given that higher quality shadows do look better, I'd say most people will be satisfied with the very high setting here, or high if you want that extra boost to performance. I'll also show headlight shadow performance here. This setting visually is very obvious as it does exactly what the labels say. I'd recommend using just your car shadows as they are by far the most noticeable, or turning them off if you are more performance constrained. The reflection setting dictates the quality of screen space and other reflections, so this setting is disabled if you choose to use ray tracing. The ultra, very high and high settings all modify the resolution of the screen space reflections. This isn't as noticeable for water and puddle reflections, but it is very noticeable on something like car and glass reflections, where the difference between high and ultra is massive. I wouldn't recommend using medium or low reflections if possible, because they essentially disable screen space reflections, which makes water surfaces look atrocious, especially at night. It actually doesn't look like the game is rendering this scene correctly with medium reflections, but that's just a product of none of the city lights reflecting onto the water surface like you'd expect. There is a 4% performance improvement between ultra and high reflections, but if you want a great visual experience, I'd still recommend using ultra reflections given the lower resolution reflections using the high mode are noticeable. That said, high is a great candidate for further performance gains. While medium does offer a 7% performance gain over ultra, the visual quality loss is substantial, so I wouldn't recommend it. Next up, we have depth of field and motion blur settings. These have a minimal performance impact, so I'd leave this up to personal preference. My preference is to disable motion blur. Bloom didn't have quite as substantial of an effect as I expected, as the bloom setting does not impact lens flares at night. However, the difference is somewhat noticeable. In terms of performance, you'll gain around 2 to 3% from disabling bloom at night. I think mostly this will be a personal preference thing, as I know many gamers hate bloom effects, but this is a good candidate for disabling if you want better performance. Ambient Occlusion affects object self-shadowing and has quite a noticeable effect on the game and quality of shadows around the game world. There are only 2 settings though, on and off, so there's not much scope for optimization. That said, the performance difference between on and off is minor at just 2%, so in my opinion, it's worth keeping this setting enabled for the extra visual quality. Post-process anti-aliasing is a simple one. You actually can't run high quality reflections and some other effects without using TAA, so you're basically forced into using it. It's the best mode visually and performance-wise anyway, so not a big deal. Subsurface scattering also doesn't have a significant performance or visual impact, so it's worth keeping this enabled for the most part. Extra details is also worth talking about briefly, as it's basically an extension to the geometry setting, so expect further draw distances and higher LODs. However, it can heavily impact performance, reducing 1% low frame rates by up to 17% between a setting of 0 and 100%. I'd expect this to be a further performance limiting factor on lower end CPUs, so it's something I wouldn't recommend touching unless you were already running the game maxed out. I'll also touch on ray tracing and DLSS here for the Nvidia RTX owners. Ray tracing in this game looks pretty good, and it's the right sort of game that can benefit from ray trace reflections because there's lots to explore in Legion and lots of nice scenery to admire. There's also lots of puddles and reflective surfaces that benefit from the feature. How much of a gain ray tracing provides depends on the environment. This lake, for example, clearly has more accurate reflections with ray tracing enabled compared to screen space reflections. The differences between medium, high and ultra ray tracing is in draw distance for the feature. A higher setting leads to more distant objects being included in ray traced reflection calculations. However, ultra regular reflections still look pretty good, so those without an RTX card aren't missing out on reflections entirely, and the difference in some situations is not that large. The same can be said for puddles. I didn't find ray tracing to be too noticeable in the puddles, as the reflective surfaces are small and screen space reflections are applied here too. There are also some water scenes, such as at night on the Thames, where ray tracing provides basically no benefit at all over the highest level of regular reflections. To me, the biggest improvement ray tracing provides is in non-water surfaces, such as glass and other surfaces. Here, ray tracing provides many more reflections at a higher level of accuracy and resolution. The quality is actually pretty good at times. It's nowhere near as noisy as, say, Battlefield 5, but of course there are still limitations to the quality, so it's not razor sharp. You'll also run into a few instances where even with ray tracing enabled, objects exceed the draw distance, and there is a fallback to screen space-like reflections, or where there is, say, pop-in for some reflected elements. These are all trade-offs to avoid huge performance penalties. Naturally, ray tracing is not something I'd recommend you enable if you are interested in high frame rates. Even turning the setting on to medium sees nearly a 40% reduction to frame rates on the RTX 2080 I used for testing this setting at 1440p. Switching that up to ultra sees a 45% drop for only a minimal visual gain, so again, if you are planning on using ray tracing, then medium is the way to go here. With that said, I wouldn't totally rule out using ray tracing. If you're already maxing out the other visual settings at a high frame rate, then enabling ray tracing for improved visuals can be a good idea. For example, if you're playing at 90 FPS, then switching on ray tracing and dropping to 60 FPS is still quite playable in a game like Watch Dogs Legion that doesn't necessarily need high frame rates for the experience. If you prefer visuals over performance, then yeah, experiment with ray tracing. As for DLSS, the visual difference between DLSS on the quality mode and DLSS off is small. However, native resolution is slightly sharper, especially for character clothing textures. As such, I wouldn't really recommend the lower DLSS modes, especially at lower resolutions, and I'd even say that a small amount of sharpening using Nvidia's filter could be a good idea for those wanting to play with DLSS enabled. It's not a situation like DLSS 1.0 where we're getting a really blurry experience, but we're not quite at the level of, say, a Death Stranding in terms of the implementation. The Ultra Performance mode looks straight up bad though. Ubisoft says this is designed for 8K gaming, but even at 4K it looks terrible, so I wouldn't recommend it. Anyway, if your frame rate is somewhere around 60 FPS with DLSS disabled, enabling DLSS will provide between a 30 and 50% performance improvement depending on the mode you choose. The higher your native frame rate, the lower the gains will be, which is something we've explored previously when talking about DLSS 2.0. For most gamers with Nvidia RTX GPUs, I'd recommend using DLSS regardless of whether you are using ray tracing or not, and the quality mode seems like a good option that's basically the same as native resolution. I know some people will say, oh well, of course you can also use DLSS to compensate for the losses from ray tracing, and I guess that is true to some extent, but really you should be using it without ray tracing enabled anyway to get that performance boost, and going from below 60 FPS to above 75 FPS is very respectable from this sort of feature. Putting it all together, I'm going to recommend two sets of hub optimized settings for people to enjoy. The first, hub quality, is for those that still want a top-notch visual experience. This is the same as the Ultra preset, but with environment dropped to high, shadows dropped to very high, headlight shadows set to your car, plus motion blur and bloom off. While this isn't a ton of changes, it actually leads to a very decent performance uplift. Then for those that want even more performance, here's the hub balanced preset. This takes geometry to very high, texture resolution to high, shadows to high, headlight shadows off, reflections high, and again both bloom and motion blur off. From either of these presets, you can add ray tracing and DLSS if supported. I'd recommend the DLSS quality mode, and if you're already maxing out game settings, then ray tracing on medium. Hub quality and ultra look very similar in general, minus the bloom effect, which is the main visual difference you'll see here. Everything from textures, texture filtering and geometry to reflections and ambient occlusion are preserved here, yet we see a performance uplift. In this exact nighttime scene, it's about a 20% gain. However, there is a clear visual upgrade on very high. Better geometry, better draw distances, better texture filtering at the cost of only a few frames per second. If you are already using the very high preset instead of ultra, this is a great choice if you're not VRAM or CPU limited, in which case you might want to go back, look at the other settings and tweak a few more things. Hub balanced, also generally a better choice than high, for a small reduction in performance depending on the scene. Again, a lot of the upgrade comes from improved geometry and texture filtering. This really is a mixture of high settings for some effects and up to ultra settings in other areas. In the benchmark tool, hub quality delivered a 24% improvement to average frame rates compared to the ultra preset. Meanwhile, hub balanced was around the mark of the high preset and about 50% better than the ultra preset. For a game that doesn't run too well if you just set the ultra preset, this is a very respectable gain. You'll also see decent gains while using ray tracing or DLSS or some combination of the two. When using just DLSS, our hub quality settings delivered again about a 25% performance gain. The performance improvement isn't as large when we add ray tracing into the mix, but still a worthwhile gain in my opinion. On top of these optimizations, I do hope Ubisoft can improve out-of-the-box performance through some tweaks to how the game works. driving in particular can see a large dip to performance in some areas, and overall I do feel the game could probably run a bit faster. I think Watch Dogs Legion is also a decent showcase for ray tracing technology, in the sense that this is the right sort of game for ray tracing implementation, and there are benefits to be had, although at the same time, there are still significant performance and visual limitations to be aware of. This isn't the only optimization guide we'll be running over the next few weeks. Hopefully we will be back to look at Assassin's Creed Valhalla as well as Cyberpunk 2077 and any other titles that require a few visual tweaks. I know you guys appreciate these guides and they do take a lot of time to put together, so thanks for watching. That's it for this one. As always, if you want to support our testing, best way to do that is through our Patreon page. Links are in the description below. You'll gain access to things like monthly live streams, Discord chat, behind the scenes videos. You guys know the drill about all that stuff at this point. Subscribe for more content. We've got some pretty good CPU and GPU reviews coming up that you'll be wanting to check out. So yeah, get subscribed, don't miss those, and I'll catch you in the next one.